My name is Shem for Shem Speaks. Welcome to my podcast. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Welcome to my TikTok. Welcome to various platforms that I'll be sharing this content on. And it's a journey that we began trying to discover some of the things and the issues that we face, or we know other people face on a day-to-day basis, or things that keep emerging as we interact with other people, as we go about our daily duties. So as these issues and as these things emerge, how can we identify them? And once we identify them, how can we manage? How can we improve ourselves despite the various issues and challenges that keep emerging? So once again, this is Shem Kalafa. Welcome to today's session. Now, we're going to put a pause slightly on the depression series because, as I said, it is something that is extremely broad. It is something that we may not necessarily be able to cover entirely because there is quite a lot of information. There's quite a lot of things that need to be unpackaged in order for us to fully not fully, but to come to some understanding of the scope of depression and its effects in our day-to-day lives. So for today, we are going to look at something called the mind and the states and levels of consciousness. This is something that emerged in the course of me trying to share with you some of the factors and issues that surround depression. And I felt rather than continue to highlight depression further, let's get to understand what is this thing or what is this element called the mind, and how does it play out into our interactions? How does it play out into how we conduct our affairs within the day? How does it play out as we undertake various tasks, undertake various responsibilities that we have with people in our day-to-day lives? And so today I felt that we really needed to look at the mind and the levels of consciousness. And the question that I'll ask us is, do you know that there are different levels of consciousness? And those levels of consciousness help us to sift out different pieces of information in the course of our day-to-day lives, in the course of our interactions. There are three levels of consciousness that you're going to look at. And these levels of consciousness are residing within the mind. But just before we go into them, someone may ask, what is the mind? The mind is basically an interaction of 3 or 4 other components. And the mind itself is a section or a part of another entire complex system called the soul. And the soul is basically comprised of the mind, the will, and the emotions. The mind helps us to reason, helps us to think, helps us to evaluate. It is a section of rationale, of reason, of logic, and of memory. The will helps us to make decisions. And the emotions, they assist us in feelings or internal perceptions of realities and their experiences. So any emotion that you may have concerning a particular experience that you are going through, it is actually a perception and an interpretation of that experience that drives that emotion to emerge. You may be wanting to think about what is it that makes you happy? What are some of the things that make you sad? The sadness, the happiness, the joy, the anger, sometimes the frustration or the different levels of emotional experiences, or the different elements of emotional experiences are based on how we relate with a particular issue or a particular person in life. And that relationship is what will drive that emotion to emerge. And of course, we talked about the will being able to help us to make decisions. So today we are going to dive specifically on the mind. and later we will look at the three states or the three levels of consciousness and how they play out in as far as interacting with information and interacting with different issues and our experience of those issues within our lives. So as I said, the mind has four components. It has the reason, it has the rational, it has logic, and it also has memory. Reason basically is the ability to be in an appropriate, clear, and justifiable sequence. It means there is a sequence that is tied to reason. One thing ties to something else. One thing adds up to something else. If it does not add up to that particular thing, then it means it has broken the sequence. And therefore, it will call for us to ask ourselves, where is this sequence broken? And how can we add what is needed to ensure that the sequence is restored? So basically that is reason. Rationale speaks to the ability for knowledge to be easily understood. Where reason applies to sequence, rationale applies to understanding. Is whatever that you are doing, is whatever that you are engaging in easily understood? Is it applying to a certain rationale? And so if it is not applying to a certain rationale, then it means that that thing perhaps was not understood. Maybe you did not understand it, or the group that you are involved in is also not able to understand that perspective. And so, because of that, it is important, therefore, to ask yourself, is that knowledge that you have received adding to a certain level of understanding that you are pursuing? Logic speaks to the ability to follow an expected pattern, leading to an expected or predictable outcome. With logic, there's always an outcome that is being pursued, that is being looked for. Therefore, if that thing that is being pursued has a predetermined pattern, it means that that pattern needs to be followed in order to get or to arrive at that desired outcome. So that's the difference between reason, rationale, and logic. Memory basically speaks to the storage of information that has been collected, whether that information has been processed or unprocessed. So anything that goes into memory is something that can either be processed or unprocessed. It's something that has been subjected to reason, has been subjected to rationale, has been subjected to logic, or it has not been subjected to those three elements for one reason or the other. And because of that, it remains unprocessed. Or it has come to a place where the requirements for reason, the requirements for rationale, the requirements for logic have not been met for that thing. And because of that, that piece of information has not been processed and it goes into memory. So there is processed information and there is unprocessed information. Now, this is not to say that that information can be fully processed. It can only be processed to the extent in which you find it useful and you find it meaningful for a particular course that you want to pursue. And so that's the element of memory. Memory is what feeds into consciousness, and it is the final stage of reason, rational, and logic. So memory is always the final stage. And what you have in your memory is what you will use in your conscious interactions with other people, with other systems, with other things that are present within your environment. That is something to remember. Now, memory has two elements. Memory has short-term as well as long-term. Short-term memory is basically used to process information in real time, which needs to be acted on up to a number of days. So short-term memory basically does not stay there for long because these are things, or these are tasks that you need to undertake within a very short period of time. It's something that you need to dispense with. Once it has come to you, you need to act on it immediately, or you need to give it a specific amount of time, plan for it, and act on it within a very short period of time. And sometimes this can go into several days. It may include things like reading or listening, receiving instructions from different sources that you need to act on. It could be instructions pertaining to a simple task, or you're watching and listening to a program on mass media, or sometimes it can be a sudden burst of a traumatic experience. Now, we talked about information that is not processed earlier. That burst of a traumatic experience, it interacts with us at a certain conscious level where we are not ready to process it. And because you're not ready to process it, we may be thinking that we are dismissing that piece of information. But what we are actually doing, we are referring it into our memory that at some point we may need to revisit. Probably because that traumatic experience is too shocking for you. And because it is too shocking for you, you choose not to address it. You choose not to process it immediately. There is also long-term memory. Long-term memory is used to store information for future use. Information here can be stored for several weeks, months, or years, up to a lifetime. Information in the long-term memory is usually deeply processed, and it's usually tied to emotional experiences based on rational analysis of those experiences. So with long-term memory, there is usually an emotional attachment towards it. There is usually information that has been processed over a period of time. And this is something that you probably have thought through. This is something that you have subjected to reason, you have subjected to rationale, you have subjected to logic. You have tried to find the connections between the information you've received and the information that you already have. And you're trying to validate that experience through an emotional feedback that you may have through it. So that emotional feedback is what helps you to store that information within memory or within long-term memory. And so some of that can include beliefs, values, or traditions that are commonly held, as well as consequences and outcomes, whether positive or negative, of actions that have been taken. So what are some of the belief systems that we have? What are some of the values? What are some of the norms or traditions that we are used to? And some of these traditions is what are being stored within the long-term memory. And the interesting thing about it is that we always keep coming back to them. We always keep referring to them whenever we want to take certain actions. We always keep asking ourselves, what are some of the consequences, whether positive or negative, or taking these actions that we are about to take in reference to these beliefs, these traditions, these values, these norms that we have been used to doing, or that we have received. So long-term memory has an influence over some of the decisions that we make. And long-term memory normally works at a subconscious level because these decisions and these actions stem from the beliefs, from the values, and from the traditions that we have received. Long-term memory, therefore, can also be used to create information bias, where we filter that information based on priority given on the beliefs and the values and the traditions that we have. So we can be biased on certain piece of information that we have received based on the beliefs, the values, and the traditions. And we can either be biased for that information, or we can be biased against it. And that's something that is very important to take note of. So what are some of the biases that we have? And when we have these biases, where are they stemming from? Can they be subjected to logic? Can they be subjected to reason? Can they be subjected to rationale? To prove whether they will be of benefit, to prove whether they will have a positive outcome or whether they will have a negative outcome from any actions that are going to be taken. And so the mind cannot exist of itself, but is dependent with the other systems of the human person. or experiences. And so there's something that I also need us to understand is this, that any experience that we have, it filters into our memory and it filters into our mind. Anything that is resident within the memory, whether it is the short-term memory or the long-term memory, it feeds into our thought levels. It feeds into our conscious thought levels. And once it feeds into our thoughts, the thoughts will always influence our words. The words will influence our actions. And actions will influence behavior. Behavior will influence habits. Habits will always feed into character. And character feeds into lifestyle or the style of living. So when you see a certain person with a certain style of living, know that there is a certain thought pattern that was processed into a habit. It was processed into an action. It was processed into behavior. And that formed their character, which formed their lifestyle. So anything that you see a person doing, be sure it started from a thought process. Whether the thought was internalized or whether the thought was subjected to a sequence of analysis, or the thought remained without being analyzed, remained without any logic, rational or reason applied to it. And so that thought fed into their behavior, or that thought fed into their actions. And those actions fed into their habits, which fed into their behaviors, and it built into character and afterwards lifestyle. That is something to think about. So anytime you have a particular thought that comes, always remember to ask yourself, what are some of the abilities or some of the resources that you have to help you to process that thought? What is the expected behavior that you are looking to have or you are looking to portray in the course of your interaction? Do you intend to pursue that interaction? Do you intend to pursue that behavior or to sustain that behavior within that interaction? Or will you need some adjustments in that behavior? Now, that is what leads to a process of learning. So as I said, we're going to look at levels of consciousness of the mind. And there are 3 levels of consciousness. There is a conscious mind, there is the subconscious mind, and there is the unconscious mind. Now, because of time, I'm not sure whether we're going to dive deep into them. And so I will try as best as I can to at least cover different elements of these 3 components of the levels of consciousness. Now, consciousness is the experience and the awareness of interacting with information. It basically means that when you're interacting with this information, you are having a certain awareness of it. You are having a certain experience of it. You're not just interacting with it. You're not just interacting with it without thinking about it. Now, there are several instances where we have had the issue of multitasking and the issue of trying to basically undertake different or several tasks at once. And this is something that has been spoken about, especially among most women. However, multitasking is simply the ability to try and reorganize or reprioritize different tasks based on the information that you have about them, and being able to switch between one task and the other while the first task or the primary task is still being undertaken. So consciousness now is that experience or that awareness. It means that this person who is quote unquote multitasking is already aware that there's another task that is currently being undertaken rather. So it is not outside of their awareness. It is within their awareness, whether they are giving attention to it or they are giving attention to something else. That's something interesting about consciousness. So it filters information based on preference and experience within the external environment and through the will. It zooms in or gives attention to information that it prioritizes. So we talked about the will being the faculty of the mind that enables us to make decisions. Now, the will now helps us to prioritize what we need to give attention to. And once we prioritize it, then that thing comes within our immediate awareness. For example, you can be washing the dishes and at the same time you are listening to music. However, at that particular time, for most of us at least, you will almost subconsciously switch from the music to attending to the dishes rather, because washing the dishes at that time is what is of higher importance. Yes, the music will be playing in the background, but the washing the dishes or attending to the dishes at that time is what will take preeminence. And so the mind has three levels or states of consciousness. I mentioned there is a conscious mind, there is a subconscious mind, and there is an unconscious mind. The conscious mind acts as the primary receiver of information. It does not regulate information coming from the environment, but through the will, it decides what information to focus on. So the conscious mind is the first level of interacting with any piece of information. You can be talking to a person through concerning a particular subject, or you can be learning or receiving information from another person concerning a particular subject, and that information usually comes first at the level of the conscious mind. The conscious mind receives that information, and one of the immediate responses is, can this information be acted on? And can it be acted on immediately? So what the conscious mind does is that it decides whether that information needs to be focused on or not. And once it decides on that, it now begins to ask, what are some of the actions that need to be undertaken concerning this particular piece of information? And so when it is when it does that, rather, when the task for that information is completed, the conscious mind immediately removes that information from its experience. And why is that? It's simply because the conscious mind wants to focus on other pieces of information so that it does not stay on the same piece of information that it had received prior. Now, something to note here. Whenever you find yourself lingering on a certain piece of information within the conscious mind, it means that at that time you are not ready to let go of that information. And sometimes this can be a traumatic experience, sometimes it can be a joyful experience. And as human beings, sometimes we get attached to experiences from an emotional point of view. And that attachment to that experience makes us long for that experience to continue. However, that may disrupt your regular schedule. It may disrupt your regular activities as you had planned them initially, because that particular information is lingering on the conscious mind for too long. And the danger of it lingering in the conscious mind beyond that time limit is that it may lead to you not letting go of that information and considering other pieces of information that need to be acted on. You may be happy or joyful about a particular experience that you have. It could be with friends, it could be with colleagues, it could be with family. However, it is important to realize that there are other pieces of information that need to be acted on. And so, to disengage from that joyful experience will be healthy in that regard. Because at that time, you have given the attention that is needed, you have acted on the task that is required within that experience. Possibly what will remain afterwards is the memory of that experience. So what people normally struggle with or what we normally struggle with, is letting go of the memory of that experience. And what that does is that it interferes or it overrides any other action that we needed to take pertaining to all other pieces of information that are present within our environment. So it is important to note that that is how the conscious mind operates. That it receives information that needs to be acted on, and once that information is acted on at that particular time, it removes it and focuses on something else. Now, this makes now the conscious mind more efficient when it comes to handling tasks. The downside is if there is too much information within the conscious experience, it can be overwhelming, and it may cause the conscious mind to shut down. So when there is so much information, and I remember we mentioned about, or we talked about someone lingering on a particular task or on a particular piece of information. Sometimes that information can be overwhelming, or when there is a series of pieces of different information that are coming to you at once. The conscious mind can shut down. And how does it shut down? When that emotion, when that experience, or when those experiences that bring this information become too overwhelming, it leads the conscious mind to decide not to act on them. So when the conscious mind decides not to act on them, it shuts down completely from those pieces of information. And this is because there is an information surge or an information overload that makes the conscious mind choose to disengage from the perceived cause of the information surge. So one of the questions that someone may ask themselves is, if there is an information surge, where is it coming from? What is the source? Now, the source of that information surge is what will lead this person to disengage from that source. I'm thinking about, again, just a joyful experience. Perhaps you've gone to a party and it's been very overwhelming for you. When there is an information surge and you feel overwhelmed, you may leave that place, or you may leave that social setting just to allow your mind time to unwind or time to breathe, because that joyful experience has been extremely overwhelming for you. Now, I'm not saying that happiness or joy are not to be pursued. They are important because it is a response to a particular experience that you find meaning and appreciation, positive appreciation in. And that is what results into that joyful experience. Now, when one lingers within the joyful experience, or when there are other pieces of information that come alongside that joyful experience, they become overwhelming. And when they become overwhelming, they begin to stress upon the conscious mind. And once that happens, the immediate response that the conscious mind has on you is that it chooses to pull you away from that information so that you give yourself time to process. And once you give yourself time to process, whether it is a few minutes or a few hours, you can now revert back to that interacting with people as normal. However, that experience will have changed the course of your interactions based on the information that you have received. Because it will be used later, once it is filtered into memory, it will be used later to regulate certain expectations that you will have with other people based on that interaction. Now, there are two key responses within the conscious mind. There is fight or flight. Fight or flight, I'm very sure we've heard of these two words. And I would like to hear from you. What are some of the thoughts that are coming to your mind when you think about fight or flight? So in case you relate with any of what I've just discussed with you concerning the conscious mind, or the level of conscious experience, Please feel free to write within the comment section. Let's talk, let's engage on how the conscious experience has been for you, or how the conscious mind has been for you, and what are some of the things that you've been grappling with, or some of the issues that you've been grappling with within the conscious mind, and how can we improve in as far as the conscious experience is concerned at the level of the conscious mind. Now, there is fight or flight, as I had mentioned. Fight response is basically this. You choose to engage with information overload by subjecting it to rationale, logic, and reason. Now, we talked about when you have a certain experience, whether it is a joyful experience, sometimes it can be a traumatic experience, where the mind or the conscious mind shuts down and disengages from the source of that experience. So in fight, you engage that information overload by subjecting it to rationale, logic, and reason. You're trying to ask yourself, how does this information connect with what I already know, with some of the beliefs, some of the values that I already know? What are some of the interactions that people are having concerning this information that you've received? Whether it has a positive emotional experience, or it has a negative emotional experience that is tied to it. And how can you manage that in as far as the resources that you have within you that have been exposed to rational, have been exposed to logic, have been exposed to reason, and how those assist in helping you engage with that information overload. Much of this is usually dependent on information that has been retrieved from the subconscious mind. The subconscious mind is something that we're going to look at later on. So in fight response, the thought is this: I think I can manage this. And it gives room to access, or to assess rather, the capacities and resources that are available to do so. That is something to think about. That as you want to fight means you want to engage with this particular information, or you want to engage with this particular thing. And so as you do that, you are saying that there are pieces of information that are adequate or are sufficient to help you engage. Now, with flight response, this is a choice to disengage from the information source, and it can be due to a perceived lack of adequate preparation to process it. Remember, we talked about low self-esteem in the previous videos. If you haven't had time to look at them, please look through depression series, part 1 and part 2, where we talked about the causes, the symptoms of depression. So this is a perceived lack of adequate preparation to process it. And what that does is that it leads you to choose to disengage. It leads to a flight response. And so this information, because of this, remains unprocessed, and instead it creates a negative emotion, which seeps that information past the subconscious mind into the unconscious mind. And the statement that comes with flight response is, I am not ready enough to deal with this. That is something also to think about. Whenever you want to flee, or whenever you want to disengage with the source of information, are you ready enough to deal with it? Are you ready enough, or do you see yourself as capable enough to deal with it? And when you don't see yourself as capable enough to deal with it, that is a point where you choose to disengage. Now, we are going to continue with the other two levels of consciousness, likely within the other podcast. Now, if you've had any thoughts that have streamed into your mind concerning what you've discussed, just feel free to write in the comment section. Let's engage more on this, and let's find a path towards a possible solution together. My name is Shem Kalafa for Shem Speaks. See you on part 2 of the Mind series. Thank you.